From the moment Attorney General Pam Bondi stepped toward the witness table in the cavernous hearing room, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation, the distant murmur of cameras and murmured questions fading into silence as lawmakers prepared to confront the highest legal official in the land, because this was not just another congressional hearing. This was the culmination of months of frustration, political pressure, and unresolved questions about one of the most controversial and emotionally charged investigations in recent history. The faces of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle were etched with determination, some grim, some measured, all aware that the stakes of this moment went far beyond partisan scorekeeping and into the territory of public trust and justice itself, as the room seemed to lean forward collectively, waiting for Bondi's first words under oath. Behind her, stacks of documents were a silent testament to a saga that had spanned years, millions of pages released, countless redactions, and bitter accusations from survivors and legislators alike that the Justice Department had mishandled files related to Jeffrey Epstein. Files that were supposed to shed light on an expansive network of abuse, but instead repeatedly raised more questions than answers. The tension was palpable, not merely because of the weighty subject matter, but because this hearing had been anticipated ever since the passage of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a law that compelled the Department of Justice to release all unclassified records related to the Epstein investigation, a law that Bondi's department had struggled to implement in full, sparking public outrage when documents were released with significant redactions that even exposed private information about victims, igniting fierce criticism from survivors, legal experts, and members of Congress alike. As Bondi opened her remarks, her tone was measured but resolute, outlining the department's efforts to comply with the law while defending decisions about which materials were made public and which remained withheld, a strategy that itself raised eyebrows as some lawmakers bristled at explanations and pressed for clarity about why certain documents were released in specific forms, and why others remained heavily redacted or delayed despite the legal mandate. The room shifted as Democratic representatives honed in on discrepancies they saw in the rollout, probing Bondi about her choices and the seeming dissonance between promised transparency and the reality of what had been provided, while Republican lawmakers, though sometimes critical, directed their questions through a prism of legal procedure and institutional integrity, together creating an emotional and analytical crucible that magnified every pause, every carefully chosen phrase, and every defensive inflection. Behind the scenes, aides and staff watched screens and whispered over notes, preparing follow-ups, reminding lawmakers of procedural hooks, and tracking every nuance that might expose weakness or strength in Bondi's testimony. Because in hearings like these, the subtlest shift in tone or the slightest hesitation can become a headline, a social media explosion, or the pivot on which public opinion turns. And as Bondi continued, contextualizing her department's decisions while acknowledging criticism, the sense of gravity in the chamber deepened, carrying with it the weight of victims seeking recognition, lawmakers demanding accountability, and a public watching closely to see whether the promise of transparency would finally be fulfilled or once again obscured by explanation, deflection, and the relentless complexity of navigating justice in an era where every document, every redaction, and every question carries enormous consequence. As the questioning intensified, Bondi leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table, eyes scanning the faces of the lawmakers with a mix of resolve and calculated caution, aware that every blink, every pause, and every carefully measured word would be dissected by cameras, journalists, and the public alike, because in a hearing of this magnitude, perception can carry as much weight as fact, and every reaction becomes a headline before the full context can even be absorbed. The first rounds of questions cut directly to procedural choices: why certain documents were released in redacted form, why others remained withheld, and what criteria had guided those decisions. Questions that probed not just administrative procedure, but the very ethics of transparency in a case that had captured global attention. Bondi responded with careful phrasing, citing departmental protocols and legal constraints, but even the most measured explanations were met with pointed follow-ups, as lawmakers parsed her statements for inconsistencies, omissions, or admissions, their eyes narrowing and pens hovering over notes, ready to document anything that could become evidence in the court of public opinion. In parallel, the staff behind the hearing room worked frantically, passing notes, preparing exhibits, and monitoring live social media feeds, because in modern congressional hearings, the external pressure can shape the pace, tone, and even content of the questioning, reminding everyone present that the narrative extends far beyond the chamber, where each moment can trigger viral discussions, opinion threads, and media cycles that shape public understanding and scrutiny. Each question seemed to ripple through the room. Some technical, dissecting legal definitions and timelines, others emotional, highlighting the plight of Epstein's victims and the public outrage over perceived institutional failures, and others strategically framed to test Bondi's composure under sustained pressure, as both Republicans and Democrats sought to extract clarity while demonstrating vigilance to their constituents. As the hours wore on, the tension grew palpable. Bondi's expressions, slight shifts in eyebrow, subtle tightening of lips, micro-adjustments in posture, were scrutinized by legal analysts and behavioral experts in real time, each minor movement interpreted as potential insight into her thought process, her confidence, or her uncertainty, a reminder that in high-profile hearings, human instincts and perception can often be as revealing as the facts themselves. Every reference to documents, every explanation of redactions, and every clarification about the department's workflow became a chess move, part of a larger strategic dance where transparency, accountability, and political optics collided, each party maneuvering to maximize credibility while minimizing exposure to criticism. Meanwhile, the public reaction outside the hearing room intensified. Social media feeds flooded with clips, commentary, and analysis. Journalists live-tweeted micro-moments, dissecting the tone of each answer, the cadence of each phrase, and the subtext in every nod or shake of the head. Public sentiment, amplified by these channels, created a secondary pressure cooker for both Bondi and the lawmakers, as every pause and every carefully guarded admission became fodder for debate, speculation, and inevitably polarized interpretations that added weight to an already tense environment. Within the room, the interplay between lawmakers and Bondi revealed a deeper narrative beyond procedure. The human stakes, the ethics of disclosure, and the tension between political accountability and institutional protection. Bondi's responses had to balance legal obligation with moral responsibility, procedural transparency with the need to protect sensitive victim information, and public expectation with bureaucratic reality. A balancing act that demanded exceptional poise, psychological acuity, and strategic insight. Analysts watching the hearing noted these subtleties, recognizing that much of what occurred was not only about factual disclosure, but about the careful management of perception, trust, and authority in an emotionally charged and politically consequential setting. As the session moved into cross-examination, the dynamic shifted subtly but profoundly. Lawmakers pressed harder, circling back to prior statements, juxtaposing previously released documents with Bondi's current answers, creating a narrative tension that felt almost cinematic, as if the audience were witnessing a high-stakes thriller unfold in real time, where every piece of evidence, every moment of hesitation, and every carefully chosen word could pivot the story and influence public trust in the Justice Department. And even as the hearing continued, a quiet calculation played across the room: who controlled the narrative, who projected competence, and who would ultimately shape how history remembers this moment, all under the unblinking scrutiny of cameras, analysts, and citizens demanding accountability. By the end of Part 2, it was clear that this hearing was far from a simple procedural event. It was a complex, high-stakes interplay of law, ethics, politics, and human behavior. Every glance, every gesture, and every syllable carried meaning, and the day's proceedings set the stage for revelations, strategic maneuvering, and public discourse that would continue long after the gavel fell, leaving audiences both captivated and unsettled, wondering what the next phase of scrutiny would uncover, and how Attorney General Pam Bondi would navigate the storm of questions, criticism, and the relentless pursuit of transparency in a case that continues to fascinate, horrify, and demand answers. The morning wore on, and the chamber's tension thickened, each question cutting sharper than the last, as Bondi faced a relentless barrage about the release and redaction of Epstein-related documents, lawmakers pressing not just for facts but for accountability, probing the limits of legal interpretation, ethical judgment, and public trust, while the cameras captured every nuance, ready to broadcast hesitation or resolve to millions of viewers hungry for insight into one of the most infamous cases in recent memory. Each reference to a document, each explanation of why certain materials were redacted or withheld, was a potential pivot point, a subtle dance between transparency and protection, as Bondi maintained composure, using carefully measured pauses to gather her words, projecting both authority and careful deliberation, fully aware that any misstep could ignite media storms and social debate. Behind her, aides shuffled, whispering last-minute reminders about procedures, past statements, and legal precedents, ensuring she stayed on message while also fielding real-time updates about newly surfaced inquiries or circulating media clips, a constant balancing act between strategy and spontaneity as the visual and digital surveillance of the hearing amplified every second into a performance where optics and substance were inseparable. Lawmakers circled back repeatedly to inconsistencies in prior disclosures, pressing for clarification about timelines, decision-making authority, and the chain of custody for sensitive files, revealing not just procedural gaps, but the human consequences of delay and redaction, the silent weight of victims' voices threading through each pointed question. The body language throughout the hearing became a language in itself, a narrowing of eyes, a slight lean forward, a momentary exhale, gestures that analysts and the audience alike interpreted as confidence, unease, or strategic deflection, demonstrating how the theater of investigation extends beyond documents and law into instinctual human behavior, where every subtle cue can be scrutinized and dissected for meaning, creating layers of tension that rivaled the content of the questions themselves. Bondi's responses, while procedural and technically precise, were punctuated by a visible awareness of these dynamics. Her tone, pacing, and emphasis seemed calibrated not just to answer the questions, but to reassure, deflect criticism, and manage the narrative, revealing the intersection of legal responsibility, public accountability, and personal poise under pressure. As cross-examination deepened, lawmakers used comparative evidence juxtaposing previously released filings with statements Bondi had made months prior, creating a pressure cooker environment where memory, documentation, and ethics collided, leaving every participant in the room alert to nuance, every subtle hesitation or qualification, potentially a fulcrum for interpretation, headlines, or further inquiry. The staff supporting both sides worked feverishly, passing notes, adjusting presentations, and tracking each question and answer, knowing that real-time accuracy and timing could shape perceptions, highlight contradictions, or reinforce credibility. A backstage orchestration that mirrored the public drama unfolding in front of them. Media coverage and social commentary surged as clips of the hearing spread across platforms, each soundbite, expression, and phrase dissected, recontextualized, and amplified, creating a dual theater of influence, one in the chamber and one across the global digital audience, a reminder that transparency, narrative control, and public engagement are inseparable in cases of this magnitude, and that every actor, from Bondi to the lawmakers to the journalists, must navigate both substance and perception simultaneously. Each new angle, every critical follow-up, and the meticulous pace of questioning reinforced the sense that this was not simply a hearing, but a high-stakes strategic performance, testing credibility, ethics, and the boundaries of governmental transparency. By late morning, the dynamics had shifted subtly, but significantly. Bondi appeared more deliberate, selectively emphasizing procedural compliance while carefully addressing ethical concerns, illustrating an understanding that perception, trust, and credibility were as vital as the factual record, and that her every move, word, and gesture contributed to the larger story unfolding, one that blended law, morality, politics, and public expectation into a single, tense narrative. The room seemed suspended in a state of constant analysis as both lawmakers and observers parsed each reaction, anticipating the next pivot, the next reveal, the next subtle concession, knowing that in hearings like this, the story emerges not only through official statements, but through the interplay of human instinct, procedural nuance, and strategic communication. As the afternoon session began, the tension in the chamber escalated, each lawmaker leaning forward with intensity, their questions sharper, more pointed, as if every phrase could extract an admission or reveal a vulnerability in Bondi's testimony. The air seemed to hum with the weight of history and scrutiny, the cameras capturing each gesture and nuance, ready to project it to a global audience hungry for accountability in a case that had captivated public attention for years. Bondi, seated firmly, scanned the room with measured awareness, weighing each question before responding, her tone a careful blend of authority, procedural knowledge, and defensive strategy, understanding that in these moments, even a slight misstep could become the focus of national debate and social media dissection. Questions turned increasingly toward the decision-making process behind redactions, exposing the complex interplay of legal mandates, ethical responsibility, and public expectation. Lawmakers sought clarity on how the department balanced protecting sensitive victim information against the public's right to know, and Bondi's responses demonstrated the tension inherent in that balance, revealing not just administrative choices, but the human judgments that shape the handling of such explosive material. Every example she cited, a document released, a file withheld, a redaction applied, became a lens through which the room examined not only policy, but character, ethics, and institutional accountability, turning procedural details into a dramatic narrative of trust, transparency, and potential oversight failure. Staff members behind the scenes whispered urgently, adjusting notes and cue cards, ensuring that follow-up questions were ready, that new evidence was referenced correctly, and that Bondi's team could respond with precision, because in hearings of this magnitude, preparation and timing are as critical as the answers themselves, and every microsecond of response can influence public perception and media framing. Observers noted the subtle psychological dynamics at play. Lawmakers' body language signaling pressure, moments of eye contact used strategically, pauses weighed for impact, and Bondi's own posture, gestures, and facial expressions carefully modulated, revealing an almost cinematic interplay of tension, calculation, and human instinct. The public's gaze, mediated through real-time coverage and social media amplification, created an external pressure layer, making every answer simultaneously an internal defense and an outward performance, as analysts dissected the phrasing, the tone, and the subtleties of body language for hints of stress, hesitation, or confidence. Each segment of testimony became a micro-drama where procedural explanation collided with moral implication, and the room itself seemed to vibrate with the stakes of accountability, transparency, and justice, as if the architecture of the chamber were amplifying the collective anxiety and scrutiny. Cross-examination intensified further, and Bondi was asked about specific cases, timelines, and internal communications, details that revealed how complex, multi-layered, and politically charged the management of the Epstein documents had become. Lawmakers circled back repeatedly to earlier answers, highlighting perceived inconsistencies or gaps, creating a relentless rhythm of questioning that tested memory, poise, and procedural accuracy simultaneously, as every word uttered, every reference made, and every explanation given was immediately evaluated for credibility, completeness, and transparency. Behind the formal questioning, a quieter battle unfolded. Aides and analysts tracked every new clip uploaded online, every emerging social media commentary, and every real-time interpretation of Bondi's tone, compiling insights that could influence future questioning or press statements. The hearing was not just a legal proceeding, but a live, multi-layered theater, blending procedural rigor, human instinct, and media influence, where the outcome depended as much on perception management as on factual exposition. By the end of Part 4, the cumulative effect of questioning had transformed the hearing from a standard congressional session into a gripping narrative of scrutiny, accountability, and high-stakes tension, leaving viewers both absorbed and unsettled, aware that each layer of testimony revealed not just procedural steps, but ethical dilemmas, institutional pressures, and the human drama of navigating transparency in one of the most explosive legal controversies of recent memory, setting the stage for further revelations, strategic maneuvers, and public debate in the session yet to come. By mid-afternoon, the chamber had settled into a tense rhythm, with lawmakers alternating between measured inquiry and pointed confrontation, each question designed to probe the limits of Bondi's explanations and the depth of her department's compliance with transparency laws. Every response she offered was filtered through layers of legal nuance, ethical responsibility, and public scrutiny, turning what might have been straightforward procedural answers into a careful performance of authority and poise under intense pressure. The reporters in the gallery leaned forward, pens scratching, cameras rolling, capturing not just what was said, but how it was said, knowing that subtle shifts in tone or hesitation could dominate headlines and social media discussion for days. The conversation quickly shifted to the handling of highly sensitive information within the Epstein files, with lawmakers asking how decisions were made regarding redactions that some claimed were excessive, while others were insufficient to protect victims. Bondi's explanations walked a fine line, emphasizing adherence to legal protocols while attempting to reassure both Congress and the public that ethical considerations had guided every choice. Yet each explanation seemed only to invite more scrutiny as questions ricocheted across procedural, moral, and political dimensions. Behind her, aides and analysts monitored reactions, noting the body language of lawmakers, tracking which arguments elicited subtle signs of agreement or skepticism, and preparing follow-ups, because in hearings of this magnitude, every micro-expression could be a window into credibility, strategy, or vulnerability. Lawmakers pressed further on timelines, asking why certain documents had taken months to release, why internal communications seemed delayed, and how the department prioritized what to disclose, creating a narrative tension that was as much about timing and perception as it was about content. Each inquiry carried emotional weight. Victims, advocates, and the public demanded accountability, and lawmakers leveraged this expectation to intensify scrutiny, turning procedural minutia into a stage for moral judgment, where Bondi had to navigate both legal obligation and the optics of human empathy. Analysts watching noted that Bondi's controlled posture, measured pacing, and deliberate emphasis were not just defensive tools, but signals of experience, strategy, and an acute awareness of the stakes that, in moments like this, perception is often inseparable from substance. The room's atmosphere thickened with anticipation as cross-examination circled back to specific redacted documents, with lawmakers juxtaposing prior statements against current explanations, highlighting ambiguities, and pressing for clarifications. Bondi's responses were carefully structured, repeating key points, acknowledging constraints, and defending procedural choices, while simultaneously conveying an understanding of public frustration, demonstrating the complex balancing act between procedural rigor, ethical responsibility, and the management of perception in a hyper-visible setting. Every reference to documents, every clarification, and every pause became part of a broader narrative about trust, accountability, and institutional integrity, elevating the hearing from a procedural exercise into a high-stakes tableau of power, scrutiny, and human judgment. Behind the scenes, the interplay of aides, analysts, and media personnel amplified the intensity as real-time social media commentary and news cycles began to shape how each answer was received and interpreted. Screens displayed trending hashtags, clips, and expert commentary, creating an environment where the public's gaze became an invisible participant in the proceedings, pressing Bondi and the lawmakers to communicate not just accurately but convincingly. Because in today's media landscape, every subtle nuance can redefine credibility or controversy within moments. As the hearing progressed, subtle psychological and strategic maneuvers became apparent. Bondi's choice to emphasize procedural adherence, her measured acknowledgement of criticism, and her controlled expressions were deliberate tools to manage both the factual record and the narrative surrounding it, highlighting the human element in governance, oversight, and transparency. The lawmakers, in turn, used both direct and indirect pressure, alternating between pointed questions and contextual framing, creating a dynamic that tested not only knowledge and memory, but composure, instinct, and the ability to maintain credibility under prolonged scrutiny. By the conclusion of Part 5, the hearing had revealed multiple layers of tension: legal complexity, ethical dilemmas, political strategy, and human behavior, all intertwined in a single dramatic event. The audience, both in the room and across media platforms, had witnessed more than testimony. They had seen a meticulous orchestration of accountability, image management, and strategic defense, leaving viewers aware that the narrative of transparency, responsibility, and scrutiny is ongoing, layered, and far more intricate than the surface facts might suggest, setting the stage for the next phase of questioning, revelations, and public analysis.